Tonight, we are going to be speaking about nuclear command and control. Obviously, a very hot topic lately with some potential nuclear threats being made over the situation in Ukraine and certainly lurking in the background of that conflict. And so we're going to be learning about how different countries choose who gets to decide when nuclear weapons are used, how that decision is made, and how that decision is brought into effect. What are the safeguards they do or don't put into place in the process of nuclear use, and why they choose the things that they do and don't do, and really how U.S. policy can fit into all this as well. And our guest tonight to talk about this is Dr. David Arceneaux, who is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. He studies several topics related to international security with a focus on nuclear weapon strategy and operations. He's got a book project that builds on his archival and original interview data with political and military elites in countries like Pakistan, India, and apartheid South Africa to explain variation in regional nuclear powers command and control systems. He also has ongoing research projects in nuclear platform diversification and North Korean nuclear operations. And his Ph.D. is from Syracuse University. Go Orange. So Dr. Arceneaux, take it away.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, John. Thanks for the John Quincy Adams Society for inviting me here and just everybody for joining here. My goal for today is to make this more of a discussion than a lecture. So all I'm going to do at the start here is kind of give you an introduction to the concept of nuclear command and control so that everyone kind of has the same terminology in mind. Try to identify some of the core dilemmas that are underpinning these decisions, because intuitively we might just think like, just do good command and control, but we'll talk a little bit about why it's not so easy as good versus bad. There are inherent trade-offs. And then I'll turn it over to Q&A. I want to mostly hear from other folks. So with that being said, I'm going to start by just kind of giving a really broad overview. I'm not really sure what we have in terms of an audience here. So I want to make sure that everyone just kind of knows what the landscape of countries with nuclear weapons looks like first. And there are currently 9 countries with nuclear weapons programs. 2 caveats. One is South Africa used to have nuclear weapons. They decommissioned their arsenal quite some time ago, after basically early 90s, around 91. So they're not on this map, but they did for some period of time have nuclear weapons. The second caveat that I will add is Israel is widely believed by analysts to have nuclear weapons, but it's very much a we can neither confirm nor deny situation. Just throwing this out there as I am proceeding with the conventional wisdom on the topic and assuming that currently, including Israel, 9 countries. And when you look at them, they're similar in that these are countries that possess one thing in common: the most destructive weapons on Earth. But they differ in really obvious dimensions. Looking at this picture here, you can, I know this is from 2020, but it's effectively the same point. You have countries like the United States and Russia in the ballpark of about 6,000 nuclear warheads. And then you have countries like Israel with bordering on 100 nuclear weapons, and all the way down to North Korea, which is now certainly in excess of that 30 to 40 estimate, closer to 50 or 60 probably. But point being, just numerically, these things are very different. And then there are also different delivery capabilities. People have gotten really hot and bothered about the idea of hypersonic glide vehicles over the last year or so, talking about how that might be a game changer. There are cruise missiles, there are short range, intercontinental range, ballistic missiles of different types. So there are all sorts of delivery systems that vary widely across these countries. But I think there's an important difference between a lot of these countries that tends to get overlooked. And perhaps not surprisingly, it's the theme of today's discussion: the command and control systems of nuclear weapons. And I'm going to just kind of give us some of this in a broad overview sort of beginning here. And the basic idea is, given that getting nuclear stuff raw is disastrously bad, nuclear weapons are the most destructive weapons on Earth by far. Intuitively, it feels like, oh, well, the states should just simply do things that manage their arsenal to promote safety and security. But in practice, we see very different things. So, as promised, here's a picture of how South Africa managed its nuclear arsenal while it had the program. And what we have here is basically a storage facility where the different components of a nuclear weapon that make it go boom were stored in these different lockers. And different acts, they get different author approval and go through different chains of command to access those individual things before they could be assembled, before they could be brought to an airplane, et cetera. So you get the idea here. For South Africa, that we said, surely that's how countries should do it, right? That's the South African model. But then we also have countries like Pakistan. And in this 2011 report, we basically, the United States got terrified to learn that it looks like Pakistan transports fully assembled nuclear weapons in unmarked cargo trucks without any military escorts. And the idea is that in a country with severe political instability and concerns regarding domestic extremism, the fact that you have these capable weapons just being transported without protection at all times through, and if you've ever been to South Asia on some of these roads, congested roads where things can go very wrong very quickly, this is not what we were hoping to see. And the United States worries greatly about Pakistan in particular for these reasons. And these examples are exactly the substance of nuclear command and control systems. So I want to just broaden this now to talk about, okay, fine, they differ, and yes, it's scary, but why might it matter? And I'm going to present basically three angles from which it might matter. The first one I've started to appreciate quite well, and that is basically if you have a deterrent threat and you say, if you attack me, I can respond with nuclear weapons. That threat is dependent upon robust command and control systems. If command and control systems fail, that threat is no longer viable, which really means if the operational details of nuclear command and control fail to operate as planned, deterrence fails. And given that deterrence is everything for nuclear strategy, that's a big problem. So what we really have here is command and control systems are at the core of one of the most important concepts in the international security, deterrence, coercion, broadly. Additionally, we'll talk about this more, I hope. This is one of the places where I think US policymakers have kind of tried to wave their hands and pretend like this is not a problem. But depending on what command and control systems look like in different countries, the likelihood of a conventional crisis escalating is very different. And we'll talk about examples. I'll wait for Q&A on this, but North Korea, hence the picture here, is one of the examples where I worry about this, where in short, the things that North Korea does to prepare its arsenal for use in terms of its command and control actually becoming ready for the crisis might look to the United States like an intent to use nuclear weapons, and that can cause problems for crisis escalation and make the United States question, should we attack now? And most broadly, this is an important idea for as countries like North Korea continue to strengthen their nuclear capabilities, and countries like Iran stay kind of on that border as latent nuclear powers, not yet truly nuclear powers, but getting pretty darn close. What should the United States be doing with respect to those countries? And one of the big problems here is that even though this concept of command and control, hopefully I've convinced you that this is a really important concept. What we know about it is primarily driven from Cold War analysis. Eric Garsky and Matt Koenig did a review of this just a few years ago, and basically you can read, I won't read it to you. They mostly said, people are not looking at this. Since the end of the Cold War, people just kind of waved their hands at it, said it's not a big concern anymore. What we learned from the United States and the Soviet Union, why not? Let's just apply it here. But the problem is twofold. First, it assumes that these countries are the same. That's dubious. Is the United States during the Cold War or the Soviet Union during the Cold War? Thousands, tens of thousands of nuclear warheads, high crisis readiness, and severely inflated threats, I'm willing to argue. But does that extend to a country like North Korea? Can we assume that those lessons apply? And even if we can, there's a problem. There really has not yet been a serious empirical evaluation of command and control systems, what they look like and why they look like they do. So that's kind of what motivates my big research project, my book project on nuclear command and control. So let me just kind of wrap up with two more points here. And this is to talk about the core dilemmas of nuclear command and control and a conceptual framework for thinking about it. So when we use the concept of command and control in the nuclear realm, we're talking to the management, deployment, and potential release of nuclear weapons. This means during peacetime, how do you manage your weapons? And then during crises, how do you get those weapons ready for use? All countries, no matter what they look like, face this core dilemma, and it's known as the always never dilemma. And it's a dilemma because on the one hand, a country's nuclear weapons must always launch when ordered, meaning an adversary cannot do anything to prevent the execution of a nuclear attack. If you attack me first, even then, I can be ready to respond. But at the same time, on the other hand, those nuclear weapons should never launch unless ordered. And this is meant to promote safety and security. And the idea here is simply that anything you do to promote one end of this dilemma necessarily undermines the other end. So I'm sure we'll talk about these today. They're called permissive action links. And on my slide here, just so you know, this is when I flew to South Africa, I interviewed a few folks from the nuclear program during the apartheid regime. This diagram was from a senior scientist with Arms Corps. And if you want to know what South African command and control looks like, there it is. And when I talk about permissive action links, what I'm going to use a laser pointer here because I'm fancy, is this right here. So you basically have over here, the uranium that goes boom. Over here, you have what's called a uranium missile for a gun type nuclear device. You shoot the missile through, it causes the chain reaction that makes things go boom, etc. A permissive action link is a technical control that you'll see in movies where you have to type in the right combination of numbers and letters in order to use a nuclear weapon. And it just literally blocks this from happening. So by doing this, okay, yes, it's more safe, it's more secure. But what that means is during a crisis, if the adversary starts motions first and attacks you first, you might be too late. So you strengthen the never component because it will be harder to use, it'll take longer, and there are things adversaries can do to undermine your arsenal. And the way that traditional Cold War frameworks think about this is basically asking, do leaders delegate the ability to use nuclear weapons or not? And we'll hear this referred to as the assertive delegative framework in just a second. But the idea is, do senior political leaders decide they want to prioritize always and enable lower level military commanders to use nuclear weapons? Or do they want to strengthen never and withhold more of that authority? But I argue that there's a fundamental problem with this framework. And at the end of the day, every single country with nuclear weapons must delegate the ability to use nuclear weapons at some point, the ability to use nuclear weapons, but rather when such delegation occurs. So this will be my last slide, and then we'll turn it over to question and answer. And I'm just going to walk you through what I have as a three-part framework. And these are going to be three kind of ideal types of nuclear command and control systems. The first one is referred to as delegative control. And this is an existing term, but what I want to basically say is that it specifically refers to when leaders delegate the ability to use nuclear weapons during peacetime. And what that means is that a state is favoring always, in that always never dilemma. They are always ready to use nuclear weapons no matter what. Military operators physically control nuclear warheads and delivery systems. There are few, if any, barriers to use. So for example, the United Kingdom is a great example of delegative control, because at all times, the commanders and the sailors on board a submarine have the ability, maybe not the authority, but the ability to launch nuclear weapons. Right now, about 7 or 8 people could get together and use nuclear weapons on that submarine if they so desire. I add a new category that, for anybody who might be familiar with this, I believe I saw Eric Gomez on the call. He's probably not heard this one as frequently as the existing literature. I refer to this as conditional control. And whereas delegative control is during peacetime delegation occurs, conditional control is early in a crisis. And what this means is during peacetime, things look nice and tight and safe and secure. So warheads might be separated from delivery systems, for example. But early in a crisis, these countries start preparing their arsenal for use, trying to make sure that the always never dilemma does not catch them in a bad position. They try to make sure that the arsenal is prepared for use as things get worse. Examples of this, Pakistan for sure, and I would argue North Korea, although data quality on that are quite problematic. But what I want to talk about later during the Q&A, I assume it will come up, so I'll withhold it, is that this rapid transition from peacetime to crisis arsenal management to an outside actor can look very scary, and that can lead to crisis escalation very quickly. And then finally, last point here before I stop, is assertive control. And this is late in a crisis. Delegation occurs. So delegative control is during peacetime. Conditional control is early in a crisis. Assertive control is after significant fighting is already underway. Only then, when things are looking really bad, and potentially even after nuclear weapons have already been exchanged, do we see the delegation to lower level military commanders who actually be able to use nuclear weapons. So I think I'll stop there. Hopefully that gives you a sense of what are command and control systems, why do they matter, category conceptual framework to discuss this moving forward. So I'll pause there and turn it over to questions from John, the room, whomever. I'm just here for your thoughts.
Excellent. Well, thank you, David. And we've got the Q&A feature open. You can both submit your questions and you can upvote others' questions that you would like to hear answered. So I'll start off with one from the audience. You're right that Eric Gomez was here, and he asks, on the crisis dynamics, how does command and control vulnerability factor into these risks of inadvertent escalation? So, in a conventional fight, it might there be increased risk of destroying nuclear command and control facilities by accident because the same system might be in use for both nuclear and conventional forces.
Yeah, so Eric, I can't see you, but thank you for joining. Great to have you on board here. And unsurprisingly, tremendous question. So there are a couple of really difficult problems here. And what Eric is pointing to is when he says that during a conventional fight, there's a risk of accidentally destroying nuclear command and control systems. And recently, scholars have started to talk about this as escalation through entanglement. And the idea is that, let's say you have a satellite constellation that is used for all military communications, whether conventional or nuclear. If during a conventional conflict, you start shooting those down and you believe that, oh, the adversary will simply assume that this is a conventional fight, we haven't used nuclear weapons. A more vulnerable adversary will absolutely look at this and say, this is concerning though, because we can no longer issue orders to use nuclear weapons. And remember what I said early on, if command and control fails, nuclear deterrence can fail. So this is absolutely one of the crisis dynamics that I think is deeply concerning and massively underappreciated. I've had discussions with some of the, for anybody who knows a name like Tim Morrison, he is one of the great foreign policy hawks of Washington, D.C. And I remember having this conversation with him, and he basically says, oh, well, we'll call them and tell them, and they'll get the message. They'll know it's not going nuclear. It depends on how confident are you that that messaging is believed. I'm a little skeptical. Tim Morrison thinks that you can exchange a couple of nuclear weapons without things getting out of hand. We approach this differently. So that's one important variety of this. But let me add a second one. And this is where I'm trying to add something new to the crisis escalation field. Imagine that Pakistan and India, which this is not too far-fetched given that India just accidentally launched a cruise missile into Pakistan, which is just terrifying when you think about these are two countries with nuclear weapons who don't exactly get along and trust one another. But Pakistan is the example of what I refer to as conditional command and control. And what that means is during peacetime, their arsenal looks really safe and secure in some ways. So they have nuclear warheads, the part that goes boom, separated from the missiles, the part that actually delivers the warheads. But early in a crisis, it is Pakistan's doctrine, before things really get out of hand, to start putting warheads on missiles. Now imagine though, Pakistan during a conventional conflict says things are getting out of hand, India is making major military gains, we need to get our nuclear weapons ready for use. And simply in the course of preparing their arsenal for use, the observation by India is, whoa, Pakistan is putting nuclear warheads on missiles, and they're moving those weapons to the battlefield. This looks to me like Pakistan is about to use nuclear weapons. Should I attack before they get after me? And this could be on a strategic level too. I'm just using an example. So for me, Eric's question is great because it talks about this like well-established idea of entanglement. I'm trying to just bring in another, in case that doesn't keep you up at night quite enough, entanglement should bother you, but so too should the ability of misperception to create incentives for leaders to say, we should attack now. And imagine as well, North Korea controlled by basically the party under Kim, and the missiles are controlled by a different body. And if the United States watches those things coming together, what does the United States do? This is a real problem that US foreign policymakers are going to have to miserable outcome.
Yeah, and so maybe to dig in a bit more, why do Pakistan and North Korea make these choices? What is it that drives them to say, okay, we need to adopt this nuclear command and control system that could lead to accidental war, which would be accidental nuclear war, meaning, you get the thing that you have the nukes to try to avoid, you get it anyway because of the way you use the nukes. What's driving that?
I thought you would never ask. Basically, you've given me an excuse to talk about, I might be wrong, but I'm going to pretend that I'm right. And I'm going to basically emphasize the specific countries that John is talking about here. And that is Pakistan and North Korea experience pressures that are different from those experienced by the United States and the Soviet Union, which motivates so much of our thinking. And this chart looks a little confusing, but think of it, and you'll notice that here, it's asking the same question. So what this really means is that this is the interaction of two variables at once. And the very shorthand version is, what does the conventional threat environment look like? What does the domestic threat environment look like? So let's think through Pakistan and North Korea. Do they have conventional fears that are near and threatening? Yes, for Pakistan, it's India. India has a much larger military. They share a long border. They fought for a long time. There's serious mistrust. All of the capabilities and ill will are there. For North Korea, who is it but Uncle Sam? It's the United States. And North Korea is rightfully terrified. And by North Korea, we're really thinking about threats to Kim in particular, but the United States that has the ability to cause serious pain very quickly in the conventional realm. So what does that mean? Think back to the always never dilemma. What that means is you might imagine you don't have as much time to prepare your arsenal for use, even against conventional threats, because if the adversary can cross the border and make serious gains in very short order, it might be too little too late. So when we have this pressure, when your external threat environment is really bad, it makes sense to delegate earlier. But then we get to this box, which is basically, what is the threat environment? And in both cases, there are problems domestically. Kim is paranoid about coups and uprisings. So then we see these really bizarre coup-proofing measures where almost like seemingly random imprisonments, separating to where it's difficult for different military branches to communicate with one another, et cetera. And in Pakistan, there are deep fears. Remember, there have been multiple successful coups since partition after Britain left South Asia. So there's this kind of alternating back and forth logic between military and civilians. There are fears of domestic extremists getting access to arsenals. So whereas external threats push for earlier delegation, these domestic threats push for later delegation, because what you want is more safety and more security to make sure that the domestic actors who don't really get along with you or might try to use these against you in some way politically, you don't want them to have access to it. And when the answer is both of these threats are present, in my mind, that's where you see these weird kind of command and control systems that during peacetime, they say, okay, on average, we want to prioritize safety and security, but in the back of our minds, we have to keep this external threat environment conscious that we don't get caught off guard and unable to use our nuclear capabilities in a meaningful way. So it's this interaction of really bad external and really bad internal threats that makes me concerned about countries like North Korea, where the things that they'll end up doing just to be prepared for nuclear use have this at the worst time when the information is poorest and when tensions are highest, are when they have incentives to start doing things that look escalatory to the outside observer.
Yeah, so I think that invites some questions like, I don't know how much is known about the Israeli nuclear command and control philosophy, but you could argue that that external threat environment has actually changed over time. That with the peace with Egypt and Jordan, but particularly Egypt, that the conventional threat to them dramatically reduced compared to, say, 1973. So have they had evolutions in how they control their nuclear forces, or do we even know?
So I'm really a little disappointed that you're asking about Israel, because if I were to walk you through the entire presentation of my research project, Israel is the one country that I'm almost certain that my expectations are wrong. And it looks like what you're saying here actually, I think, plays into it somewhat. The short version is we might expect, given what conventional military operations look like, the military is very influential and they have a lot of control over a lot of conventional operations in Israel. That does not apply in the nuclear realm. So what's interesting is you would expect to see that transition to be more likely after the conventional threat environment becomes a bit more tolerable. But realistically, what we actually see is in Israel, from what we can tell, and I'm not super confident in making this claims because externally, we basically have Avner Cohen as the only real source of command and control stuff in Israel. It's just so hard to get anything and triangulate those data. But it looks like that has just been the name of the game as long as they've had these capabilities, almost regardless of what that threat environment looks like. But to your fundamental point of would we expect to see changes over time if these variables change in values? So if a country goes from having a severe external threat environment to not having that, the answer is yes. But the portion of that chart that I did not discuss incorporates civil military relations. The clear examples of this are what did the Western European countries like France and the United Kingdom do after the collapse of the Soviet Union? And this is important because you say the conventional threat is basically gone. But at the same time, we see the United Kingdom after the Cold War still having, during peacetime, delegated the ability. Again, they're supposed to wait for authorization in order to use them. But literally, these people can use those nuclear weapons no matter what during peacetime, even in the absence. And that's where my argument goes on to say, beyond the kind of interactive, this composite threat environment, there are also these civil military organizational pathologies at play that explain why, yes, this variable has changed a lot, but we still see continuity in what command and control looks like over time.
How about in the Iranian case? If, I mean, obviously they don't have nuclear weapons right now. They've long, for probably 20 years, everybody's been saying they're 5 years away or 3 years away. What do you think that they would choose as their command and control philosophy if they were to get a nuclear weapon?
Yeah, this one's an interesting question. And I will say you probably know more about Iran than I do. So if I mischaracterize something, please correct me here. But my basic understanding of Iran is that they're likely to fall into the same camp as like a North Korea, Pakistan, where they have severe conventional concerns against the regime in particular. This is a country that has experienced regime change from outsiders before, an attempted regime change. So there's kind of this persistent fear that things can go wrong. But at the same time, when you look at things like the IRGC, and you have these different like intelligence services and military branches kind of split apart for different purposes, these are the classic indicators of coup proofing and a lack of trust of the military. So we're seeing these pressures in opposite directions. So my expectation would be Pakistan would be another unfortunate, Pakistan. Iran would be another unfortunate addition to that bucket of conditional control that we're seeing in definitely in Pakistan and probably in North Korea as well, just because they're trying to satisfy two pressures that are really hard to square in a way that checks both of the boxes.
Yeah, and I think I would agree with your assessment there. They have multiple militaries, multiple competing intelligence agencies. It's definitely not a place with high trust. They've had a couple of cases under the Islamic Republic where they thought there might have been a coup coming. A lot of those incidents are pretty murky, but there's definitely, I think all those pressures are definitely there. We've got a question from Luke Venezia who asks, how does the International Atomic Energy Agency affect the command and control of nuclear forces? And if it doesn't, is there something that we should be looking toward for more safe and secure use or command and control philosophy around nuclear weapons? And I guess part of what I would add to this maybe is, could we make the nuclear world a lot safer and more stable if we were just like, hey, we're going to make a really good permissive action link that anybody can use and we'll give it to anybody who wants it, something like that. Like, are there technical solutions to these problems?
Yeah, these are great questions. And these are problems that US foreign policymakers have tried to deal with for a long time with really mixed signals in ways that I think undermine the effectiveness. But let me put it this way. I'll kind of work backwards from John's US specific example of could we just create a permissive action link? Remember, that's just a little digital code thing I said can block nuclear detonation from occurring so long as it's present. And really advanced permissive action links that the United States have, they come in different classes, and some of them are what we call tamper-proof, meaning if you try to get around them, it destroys critical components of the weapons. So ideally, every country in the world would have this, we would hope, because what it means is nuclear weapons, you won't have some lieutenant colonel who's in the field who just kind of accidentally misperceives what's going on, whatever. But there are a couple of problems here that I'm afraid, as optimistic as we might want to be, make this unlikely to occur. One is basically the United States has kind of pitched this idea before to Pakistan. And I interviewed a retired SPD, Strategic Plans Division, from Pakistan. He's now out in California, so I couldn't get a visa to go to Pakistan, so I was lucky that he was out here. And he was intimately involved in developing in these procedures. And he was around when the United States pitched the idea of saying, hey, why don't we just give you permissive actions? And imagine this from Pakistan's perspective, though. The United States comes to you and says, let us see your nuclear weapons and put some technology inside of them. So Pakistan basically said no for two reasons. One is they don't want the United States to know what they have. They want some sort of ambiguity in terms of what they can do, how many they have, where they're located. Because Pakistan caught wind a few years ago that the United States has plans in the case that something goes wrong domestically. The United States actually has plans to basically go show up and try to seize control over Pakistan's nuclear weapons. And it doesn't want the United States to think it can do that. But the other thing is they worry that if the United States gives them this technology, how do you know it doesn't have something embedded in it that literally makes nuclear use impossible? So the Pakistanis just said, appreciate it, that's great and all, but we don't trust you to actually let us manage our arsenal and not try to take it from us or try to prevent it from being usable. So that's one problem, is that the receiving countries don't really seem to have any sort of will to engage in that realm. I think reasonably so. I would be, if I was in Pakistan or North Korea, I would be immensely concerned about this. The place where I said that this has been somewhat hypocritical in US foreign policy is China, many years ago under the Clinton administration, actually requested more technology for permissive actions. They came to the United States asking for some sort of help, and the Clinton administration appears to have said no. So the United States is kind of sending mixed messages on, in some countries, they really want to try and push this, in others they can't. To broaden this out a little bit, though, think about those competing pressures that I mentioned as well. And the short version is, if a country is really worried about its threat environment, that is not something that the United States or the IAEA can credibly fix in a meaningful way. And so long as that threat is present and those incentives to delegate earlier are present, I don't think we'll see the political will on the end of those countries either to request more control when they have reasons to try and be ready to use nuclear weapons earlier.
Yeah. I mean, in the case of North Korea, it'd be like, what are you going to do? Make North Korea bigger, give it a better military so it's not as scared. It would be at odds with some of our other goals in the area.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. So another question that I think is on a lot of people's minds these days is Russia. With the talk of some potential nuclear threats there. I mean, the other day there was basically Peskov basically restated the nuclear doctrine. We'll use nukes if the existence of the state is threatened. What is their command and control philosophy look like? What are the things that like our people are looking for to see what they're about to try to do if they were to try to use nuclear weapons, whether, a big strike on the US or maybe even, some of this talk of like a single use against perhaps Ukraine.
Right. So this is, and I think I see there's another question about basically how do we know? So I'm going to cheat and kind of answer John's question here about that, while also mixing in this anonymous attendees question of what sort of intelligence operations go into it. And I'll start in reverse order there. In truth, there's a lot of guesswork here. And when I started my presentation by saying, wow, there hasn't really been empirical analysis of what this looks like, part of the reason for that is, how do you get countries to really tell you what's going on? And for me, the solutions have been fly to South Africa, where basically they no longer have nuclear weapons. And one of the guys I interviewed basically said, look, we're all 80 something years old or dead. We're not going to get in trouble if we tell you something. So South Africa is like a weird example. Okay, but I got great information. India is interesting in that I've had a lot of success interviewing ex-military officials. But this is a symptom of India's bizarre civil military relations, where the military is kept at arm's length. And whenever a Western scholar shows up, giving them a chance to talk, they just kind of say, thank goodness someone's taking us seriously, let's talk. And they won't tell you like every little detail about it, but you can get sufficient impressions to know some general guidelines. But those are the good cases. And then to the question that we're getting here about how do we know something about, let's say, China or Pakistan? And the answer is you basically have two sources. One is somebody says something they shouldn't. This has happened in China, and that person went to prison for a very long time. And the other option is there's extensive classified material that we don't know about. So I think it will be next week. I've been invited to an event for the Nuclear Posture Review, where they're talking about evaluating command and control systems. And this is exactly why I'm so excited to attend, is because I'm curious to know, how is the government making these assessments? A lot of it appears to be open source, and I'm afraid we just really don't have great insight into it. So that's just kind of saying the quality of data that we have across the range of nuclear countries varies widely. But with Russia, so now let me kind of take that and motivate it for my response to John's question about what's going on with Russia, what should we be concerned about? The very short answer is that with decent confidence, we believe that what we see in Russia now looks like what it was during the Cold War. And that was relatively assertive command and control. And think about the domestic pathologies that plagued many of the leaders of the Soviet Union, fears of coups and upheaval domestically, et cetera. So that explains a lot of the kind of desire to retain control over nuclear capabilities and command and control of nuclear weapons. And it looks like Russia currently has warheads for many of its strategic systems. This can vary by platform, to be clear. But for many of its land-based missiles, it looks like the warheads and the missiles are separated. So when Putin came out and basically said, things are getting out of hand, and I forget his exact phrasing, it was some kind of special regime of heightened alertness or some bizarre combination of words. What he was basically saying is, I want nuclear weapons to be more prepared. But what it looks like the defense minister actually did was more or less put more people on heightened alert at command and control centers. So there are more people checking in with units more regularly. There are more people watching the early warning kind of systems, such as they exist in Russia. But there has not been any observed movement to put the warheads on the missiles for those strategic capabilities. So it sounds scary, and it's meant to sound scary. It's meant to make the West look at this and say, oh no, things are getting out of hand, let's back down. But what we've seen in practice suggests that we're not there yet. If we get, those are the kinds of signals though that US policymakers will be looking for in this conflict. Are we seeing things like aircraft preparing and being on, are they on strip alert, basically ready to go in a few minutes? Are we seeing warheads going from facilities where the United States kind of knows where they are, meeting up with some sort of transporter or Erector launchers, the things that launch them, and then you see them kind of disappear into the wilderness? Those are the things that make you say, okay, we've gone from this really assertive kind of control to a delegated posture where now the military can use nuclear weapons.
All right. Well, hopefully folks are keeping a good eye out for that. Another part of the question there was about alliances and nuclear command posture. You know, how transparent are countries that, you know, tend to have a relatively high level of trust toward each other, like say the UK and the United States, with each other? How does having those kinds of you know, fairly high trust alliances shape the postures of these countries? You know, because I know even back in the day, you know, there was the whole Skybolt affair, which, you know, reflected both trust and then distrust. I'm curious what your thoughts are here.
No, I think this is a really sharp question too, because this is, you know, I've been spending my time talking about adversarial relations, but this is a thing that is becoming more pronounced because the United States and the United Kingdom have a long history of very close cooperation in the nuclear realm. And now, over the past few years, we've seen Macron of France saying that there should be a Euro deterrent, basically that France and the United Kingdom could combine to provide nuclear deterrence for the continent because it's more credible from them than the United States, who maybe won't actually come to their defense. So historically, it's been important, and presently, it looks like it's becoming more important. So I'm really glad that John's pressing me to think this part through. And I think the framing of elements of trust and distrust is spot on. So if you ever ask someone from Britain about just how independent their nuclear arsenal is, the United States will often say, like, it's basically our arsenal. We just let you play with the toys every now and then. But the Brits will say, that's nonsense. Yes, we've had cooperation in terms of develop, literally from the Manhattan Project, helping get to fission reactions, but then also talking about shared funding and platform development. But at the same time, yes, the United States, through NATO, there's supposed to be, this is one of those great moments in international politics. What we say and what we do are almost certainly going to be different things. So if nuclear use was ever to be considered in the context of NATO, so these very friendly countries, the United States, France, and the United Kingdom, that share a lot of intelligence and technological transfers, they're theoretically supposed to coordinate, collaborate, decide what targets are appropriate, when to mobilize, who can use them, all of these things. But in practice, even when countries place their nuclear weapons under NATO command, the United Kingdom, who had this for a while, maintained an independent command and control chain to make sure that no matter what, it's ultimately going to be a British decision. And what that means is even if these NATO countries come together and say, you know what, it's time, let's go ahead and do this, it still requires Britain to say, okay, let's do it through our means of employing these forces. So there are deliberations, there are discussions that are meant to occur in this realm, but whether or not those would actually happen during a crisis, I'm a little skeptical. And I think the, you know, those guiding principles of international politics that everyone looks out for themselves, they don't suddenly disappear because NATO exists. So I would expect that the fact all of these countries maintain their own independent command authorities tells us a lot about what that would look like in practice. Yes, they talk and they share to some extent, but at the end of the day, they want it to be a national decision rather than an alliance-based decision.
So related to that, I mean, there's also the nuclear sharing arrangement in NATO with, you know, Germany and the Netherlands, and I think Turkey, maybe a couple of others. How about that? Where does that fit into this?
So this is one of the United States. The argument will be this is meant to be a non-proliferation tool. So this, I would just put this in the category of extended deterrence. And this goes in two ways. In one direction, it's the United States does not want more countries, even if friendly, to get nuclear weapons, because any country with nuclear weapons is less responsive to pressures from the outside. So the United States seems to have this obsession with being able to get what it wants anywhere, anytime, everywhere. And one of the great, so Frank Gavin has made this argument that one of the great driving forces of US grand strategy in the post-World War II environment has been non-proliferation. So what this means is the United States is promising countries like Germany and Turkey, if you're attacked in a serious way, we are willing to use nuclear weapons to defend you. This is for all NATO countries, theoretically. France didn't buy it. And there's the famous aphorism, I always mix up the cities, but it was from France that basically said, is the United States really willing to trade bits of ours? Are they willing to trade New York City for Brussels or Paris? And France answered that question with no, therefore we develop our own. The purpose of the forward basing is to try and make that promise more credible. Trying to basically say, not only are we saying that we would come to your defense with nuclear weapons, but we're going to give you some skin in the game. We're going to put them on your base so they're in theater and they're ready to go. We promise, please don't acquire nuclear weapons. Pushing in the other direction, there are countries like Germany, and this will be interesting now that we basically are watching Germany potentially backtrack on decades of reluctance to spend heavily in foreign policy on military capabilities. But Germany basically wants the benefits of nuclear deterrence without paying the money or committing the resources to it. And historically, they just basically said, we love the US extended nuclear umbrella. It's better than us having to do it ourselves. Let's go ahead and invite them in. So it depends on the country. Turkey, people worry about a little more right now, but these kind of weird things, they're meant to basically be extended deterrence guarantees, yes, to deter external aggression against those allied countries, but also to prevent nuclear proliferation by those allied countries. And from the country's perspective, it can sometimes be, we don't want to invest in that. This is a way of getting.
Yeah, and so going, a little further on U.S. policy, back over toward those adversary countries, how, since conventional threats in particular are a component of how these countries are shaping their nuclear command and control philosophies, and there are certain philosophies we don't want them to adopt. Are there choices we make in the conventional realm or the political realm that might make it more likely that these countries adopt more or less threatening, from our perspective, command and control postures?
I think absolutely so. So if you remember, when I was talking about assertive control, China is like a classic example of assertive control, where warheads, missiles separated by long distances. The ability to access an individual component requires approval, and then there are protections within accessing it. They have their own indigenous kind of technical control over it. All of the stuff that we would want to see a country doing in that sense, China kind of doesn't. North Korea, I think, could be that kind of a country. Because remember, North Korea, I said, faces the severe external threat from the United States, but also the domestic concerns that the Kim regime feels. If you could ameliorate those external concerns, the pressures to delegate earlier are reduced. So the consistent US promise, or sorry, the well-established US record of promoting regime change, for example, North Korea looks at that and says, oh no, you see what happens to the guys who don't have nuclear weapons. Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi, who basically forswore nuclear weapons, made a deal with the United States, and the United States helped get rid of him anyways. And the question is, like, is it too late to go back on this? Maybe. But if the United States were not so committed to maintaining the options, and we have people like Mike Pompeo, when he was Secretary of State, saying regime change is good. John Bolton, regime change is good. We need the Kim regime out. Those things start pushing away from assertive control and towards those patterns of command and control that we don't like. So to the extent, this is purely from a US perspective now, but to the extent that the United States is placing those conventional military pressures on countries that don't necessarily need to be there, that is making this problem worse. And North Korea is the place in particular where I worry about that quite greatly.
So South Korea has kind of been developing its own conventional strike capability, the kill chain, which, some of the stuff they put out around it, I remember them dropping a bomb on a bunker with a guy that looked like Kim Jong-un in it. Could it be the case that even if the U.S. reduces the level of conventional threat and says, hey, we'll withdraw from the area, and maybe North Korea gets some kind of arrangement where they can figure out where our carriers are or something. I don't know what it is, but that even if the U.S. reduces the threat, that the South Korean threat might be high enough that they say, hey, we still want to be able to deal with what's an existential threat to the part of our regime that we care about.
I think that's entirely fair, and that's been a relatively recent development. South Korea has kind of always had this idea that if only we could break apart the Kim regime, maybe things would get better. But to the extent that they've started developing these and I think the New York Times had some articles on these small units that are designed literally, if things go bad, to go kill Kim, basically. To the extent that those exist, North Korea knows they exist, and they think they might work, you're exactly right. The United States' ability to influence that will almost certainly be reduced. The pushback to that is it's still better in terms of certainty to have one major threat than two. Because if North Korea, with its limited intelligence collection capabilities, et cetera, and insight into US military capabilities, if it doesn't worry as much about the United States and it can focus more on South Korea, that at least puts a little bit of downward pressure on those escalatory pressures that I worry about. I think it's not ideal, but it would still be better than the alternative.
Time for one more question. We'll go to Byron Stokes, who asks, can you discuss the role of Congress within the U.S. nuclear command structure? Is congressional authorization required for nuclear actions, especially outside of self-defense?
Yeah, so this is also a great question. And shortly after Trump was elected president, Congress held a hearing for the first time in, I forget how many years, decades, basically saying we need to revisit what command and control procedures look like. And the reason they were saying that is basically a lot of congressional members thought Trump was unhinged and might use nuclear weapons without trying to ask anybody for help. And that is reflective of the reality of the US command and control systems in the nuclear realm. Technically, the president has sole launch authority. If the president says go, the order is supposed to be issued out. During peacetime, so there's a difference here though. There's a difference between the president waking up the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff and saying, it's time, let's go, versus the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff waking up the president saying, things are out of hand, we need you to make a decision now. The hope is that in practice, the president should meet with some number of cabinet members, probably Secretary of Defense, maybe Secretary of State, hopefully Joint Chiefs of Staff. If they decide, yes, let's go ahead with it, that order is issued out to Strategic Command, STRATCOM. And STRATCOM basically has one job. A one-star general is in charge of this job. It is to verify that the order is legal. A lot of room for interpretation there. You can interpret this as being a good thing because, oh, well, a good STRATCOM commander is going to know this is crazy and won't do it and find a legal justification. Or you can be concerned and say, self-defense is always legal. If STRATCOM says it's in self-defense, we're going to go ahead and okay it. That's really the only major check, because the president will simply call in and say, here are my codes to prove I'm who I say I am. Now go ahead with this pre-planned action or whatever. STRATCOM says, yes, the order goes out and it's in the hands of the operators then. So Congress, in a literal sense, Congress plays no role. And the purpose of that hearing after Trump became president was to try and figure out, is there a way to get Congress involved? And the trade-off is basically, again, if Congress gets involved, think about how hard it is to get agreement on anything. Now think about trying during a crisis to get Congress to agree on whether or not we should use nuclear weapons. In terms of time pressures, it's impractical. And that's why the United States has kind of leaned away from that option. Congress is currently out of the loop. This will maybe be my concluding thought then. The Biden administration is putting together a nuclear posture review that's coming out in what they called early 2022. What does that mean? I mean, probably this year, maybe November, maybe that's early, I don't know. But Biden has promised to review the concept of sole authority. I doubt that means Congress gets involved, but there could be some qualifications that the Biden administration tries to add here. That absolutely, I mean, that's in the realm of worth watching.
All right, well, that is all the time we have. I've dropped some of those upcoming opportunities in the chat. Thank you to Dr. David Arceneaux, University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, for taking the time to chat with us about nuclear command and control around the world. A very enlightening, if somewhat disturbing, field of study. Thank you again to you and to everybody out there in the audience who attended tonight, and we will see you all next week.
Thank you guys again for inviting me and for all the great questions. This was a blast. Had a great time.